Let's go to New York and speak to Bernard E. Harcourt. He is a professor of law and political science at Columbia University. Professor, thank you so much for your time. What did the George W. Bush administration think could be achieved with the opening of Guantanamo Bay that couldn't be done through the normal application of domestic and international law?
Well, the truth is that the Bush administration wanted to create a space that was outside of American constitutional protections and American constitutional law, a place where the due process clause of the United States Constitution doesn't apply. And actually, since that time, they've been arguing that the due process clause doesn't apply to Guantanamo. And so that was really the effort, to find a place where they would be able to detain people, but not be under the strictures or the review of any American court.
When you look at some very basic figures, almost 800 prisoners in the 20 years, only 12 of them ever charged, only 2 ever convicted by military commissions. In 2006, Seton Hall University looked at about 600, almost 600 of those prisoners, and found that more than 50% of those 600 had not even committed hostile acts. So that shows, in a way, the relative failure of Guantanamo Bay, and yet it remains open. Why?
Yeah, it's more than a failure. It's a travesty of justice, of course. I think we can all agree on that. It remains open because there are 39 men left there, of which, as you mentioned, some have been charged and are proceeding in front of a military commission, approximately 7 or so, in part related to the attack at the Twin Towers. Now, those prosecutions have been going on for decades now, and there hasn't been much progress in terms of those. The rest of the individuals, so the vast majority of the 39 men who are left there, are not charged. Many of them have been approved for release or transfer by what's called the Periodic Review Board, which is an internal review board composed of the highest department level people, State Department, Department of Justice, et cetera, in the United States. So they've been approved for release, and yet they haven't been transferred yet. Only one was our client, Abdul Latif Nasser, who was returned to Morocco, but the others have not been. And in part, well, there are different reasons for that, but the Biden administration is pretty much attributing it to questions of diplomatic relations with the countries that would receive the men.
Isn't there also an issue in Congress, particularly amongst members of the Republican Party, because any president would need congressional approval to go ahead with the closure of Guantanamo Bay, but Republicans especially seem to be particularly against it? What does it say about their political philosophy, about those members of Congress who are continually against the closure of this facility?
Right. I mean, it's important to understand that the Republican Party in this country is not in favor of closing Guantanamo and tries to create obstacles at every possible turn to avoid the closure or the transfer of any of the men who are detained at Guantanamo onto U.S. soil. That was the biggest problem, was that a Republican Congress prohibited Obama from transferring the men onto American soil, where they would have received a different treatment, probably just federal court prosecutions if there were any. So there have been blocks put in place, but the Biden administration can transfer the men who have been approved for transfer out of Guantanamo. It's just a question of making that happen. It's long overdue.
Just briefly, if you don't mind, finally, Professor, do you see the possibility of future lawsuits against the U.S. government from detainees?
Well, I see the possibility of lawsuits. As to the likelihood of their success, I'm not sure, in large part because of these constitutional questions in terms of violations of constitutional rights, whether or not the due process clause applies at Guantanamo. The Biden administration is actually taking the position that it does not apply Guantanamo, which I think is a radical position to take. since that would mean that effectively one could do any kind of treatment. It would never be protected by due process. But there are rules about qualified immunity, which are complicated rules under American law, which immunizes officials from lawsuit in cases where there aren't clear constitutional rights that are being violated. And so I think that it would be a big hurdle to achieve success in one of those cases. But I suspect that there will be then those efforts.
Yeah, those sorts of barriers were exactly why we wanted to get your take on those future possibilities of lawsuits. Professor, thank you so much indeed. That's Bernard E. Harcourt speaking to us from New York.